If we know we need to have slightly higher carbohydrate, protein intakes, how are we going to define that so that we know how much this is for each of us? Yeah. So should we go with, I was speaking about RDIs and upper limits and talking about grams per kilogram per day, blah, blah. Should we use that? Should we just go with that? Like, is that going to be a really helpful way to define things? And I'm just going to say, just blatantly, no. It's absolutely useless. Okay? Most of us don't understand that anyway. So, but it's beyond that. Even if you did understand it, it's useless. All right? That's number one, and you'll see why I say that in a second. Number two, maybe we should then do it this way. So maybe we should take percentage of our calories. So if you look at dietary guidelines currently say we should have 54% of our calories should be from carbohydrates, 30% should be from fat, and the rest, 16%, should be from protein. Is that helpful to anyone? Well, sure as hell is not helpful to me. It all depends on how many calories you're having in the first place. So we've got to know how many calories we're having to then define that more specifically. And that becomes extremely complicated. And then, are we having the right amount of calories? And then we have to start counting calories. And then we have to be worried about calories. And we shouldn't be. So this one is not a good way to go either. It's unhelpful, and for most people it's confusing. So then what should we do? This is what we should do. We should be looking at grams per meal. Every time you sit down to eat, you should be looking at how much protein you have. Now you're going, well, I don't know how much protein is in this food, but I'll get to this. But I want to explain to you why it's so important to look at grams per meal and not over the extended period of a day of 24 hours, which we've discovered is useful, not useful at all because of that top one. So grams per day. Now, in order to explain this to you clearly, I'm going to get a little bit sciencey, just a little bit. I promise not to make it too foreign, but a few little words. So if we look at protein under a microscope, we will see that it is made up of little building blocks. And these building blocks we refer to as amino acids. Okay. There's lots and lots of different types of amino acids, but the one that we are most concerned with for these purposes today is an amino acid by the name of leucine. Okay. So if you remember one thing today, you can remember leucine. Now, why are we concerned with leucine? Well, let's take a step back. Remember, we've got three macronutrients. We've got carbohydrate, protein, fat. We should eat carbohydrate and fat for energy. Those are what fuel us, give us energy to do things in our day. Protein, we should not eat for fuel, for energy. Protein should be used in our body for building, for repairing, for regenerating, for the manufacturing of enzymes and hormones. That's what protein should be used for in our body. Okay? Now, this is where we need to listen really carefully. If in a meal you have enough of that little amino acid that I mentioned before, that's it there, leucine. If you have enough protein in a particular meal so that you have enough leucine, you will stimulate protein synthesis. If you do not have enough leucine to stimulate protein synthesis, then all the protein that you eat at that particular meal will be used for fuel. Do you want me to repeat that? So if you eat a meal and it's sufficient amount of protein to stimulate enough leucine, which will then stimulate protein synthesis, we get the big tick. If we don't have enough protein in a particular meal, all the protein that we eat cannot be used for protein synthesis, and instead it is used for fuel, i.e. it is more calories and most likely going to end up as fat. Okay? So we have got to eat enough protein at one particular sitting so that we get enough of this thing called leucine so that protein synthesis can actually occur. Otherwise, we're just adding to our calorie bank. Okay, so now we need to start thinking about numbers here. Okay. So let's take a look at this little graph here. So this is an indication of when protein synthesis actually occurs. So those little numbers down the bottom, 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2, and then we see, suddenly, we start getting a little bit of protein synthesis happening. And at 3, that's when we get this trailing off of protein synthesis. Now that's what's important. We want to get that line sticking up there at the top for a period of around about 3 hours. So we've got to get to that 3 in order for that to happen. So we need 3 grams of leucine in a meal in order for this process to occur so that we stimulate protein synthesis and we don't just add fuel and fat. Okay. So how does this then relate to protein? There we go at the bottom in red. So it's about 10 grams, 20 grams, 30 grams of protein we need in a meal in order to stimulate protein synthesis. 30 grams. That is the magic number. Why is it magic? Because it doesn't matter if you are a 6'5" footballer or a petite, tiny female. Do you know that your leucine threshold, and that's what we call that number 3 number, the leucine threshold, is the same. It's identical for every single person once you stop growing. This does not apply for kids. I often get this question at the end, so I'll cover it quickly now. This does not apply for kids. Kids stimulate protein synthesis hormonally. Once you're somewhere between 18 and 25, you make the switch from stimulating protein synthesis hormonally to leucine stimulating protein synthesis. So it doesn't apply for kids. But everybody else, doesn't matter how big you are, how small you are, what activity you're doing, everybody else has to have 30 grams of protein in order to stimulate this process. What does that look like? What does that look like on your plate? This gives you an idea. So, if you're eating about 140 grams of meat, that's about 30 grams. If you're eating, down the bottom, eggs, people go, oh, I have protein at breakfast. I have 2 eggs on toast. Oh, well, that's all fuel. That's not doing anything. Yes, you can take a picture if you like. So if you're feeling a little bit confused right now, if you think of a piece of meat and it's 140 grams, that's not all protein. There is water in there, there is fibre in there, there is fat in there, there's a whole lot of other stuff in there. The protein component of 140 grams of steak is 30, roughly. You get it? Makes sense now? Okay. Yes?
Are all amino acids the same?
No, they don't. So, an important point here is that leucine is not going to be equal in all of our proteins. When we have animal-based proteins, that's when we apply this. If you've got your vegetarian-based proteins, that's a different story. So leucine levels are going to be different in vegetarian-based proteins. The best way, if you eat more of that sort of stuff, the best way is to get yourself a little app on your phone. There's plenty of them out there. The one that I work with the most is called Easy Diet Diary, and from there you can track what your protein intake is like at a meal. You can use nuts and seeds to prop you up, or dairy products to help prop you up, or whatever it is that you like. You know, if you don't want to have 140 grams, you can put some nuts and seeds into your salad with that meal. Or there's a whole lot of little things that you can do to make that a bit easier. Yeah. Yes, always raw. Always raw. Always quote the amount raw. Yeah.
Vicky,
Yes.
you haven't put any white fish in there, right?
Yeah, I just used a few examples, but yes, you know, they're similar. So once you're looking at meats, fishes, they're going to be roughly around the same amount. So you can always take a fairly good guess. You know, if you're having about 150 grams of a meat, you're probably going to be pretty close to where you need to be. Yeah.
Is that daily or per season?
No, this is per meal. Remember that slide?
5 eggs in 1 meal.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that you need 30 grams. If you want to make it up with 5 eggs, make it up with 5 eggs. But if you want to have, 2 eggs, a bit of bacon and some cheese, then make it up that way too. So, yeah, this is just to show you what it might look like.
That is 5 small.
50 grams of eggs.
5 big eggs.
Yeah, so that, the 50 grams eggs in the supermarket are classified as large. And then extra large is the bigger ones.
Where would cheese fit in there?
So I'm going to come back to questions. I'm going to keep moving, otherwise we're not going to get through tonight. But the best way, because everybody's going to say, what about this, millions of different foods that we have available to us. Easy Diet Diary, look it up. Yeah? Okay. All right. I just want to show you what most people do and why most people are not getting where they want to be. So we've got, this is what typically an Australian intake looks like. Breakfast, about 10 grams if you're lucky. Lunch, 20 maybe, because you just shove a little bit of meat into your sandwich or your wrap. And then way too much at dinner. If we took that same amount and all we did was distribute it differently, we would have a very different effect. Because 3 times in that day, we will stimulate protein synthesis, whereas in the typical day, we only stimulate it once. When we stimulate protein synthesis, we go into a state called an anabolic state, a building up state. Are we all familiar with that word, anabolic? So building up. So when protein synthesis occurs, we go into an anabolic state for roughly 3 hours. So in a typical Australian's day, they are in an anabolic state for 3 hours, which means they are in a catabolic state. They are breaking down for 21 hours a day. If we do it the other way around and we go 3 times a day, we are then in this anabolic state 3 times a day. What that can do in terms of your health outcomes and your weight outcomes is hugely, hugely significant. How? I'll show you just how significant. So this is one of the guys that I mentioned right at the start. And I know this is very sciencey, but it gives you a great understanding of why this is so important. So I'm going to run through this in detail with you. So this study was conducted where they took 4 different groups of people. It was done over a 16-week period, and these 4 groups had exactly the same amount of calories. So their calorie total was identical. So if ever anybody says to you, a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, run a mile. A calorie is not a calorie. Our calories behave very differently in our bodies. So we have one group they called it the carbohydrate group, but that was basically dietary guidelines. Remember I said 54%, 16%, 30%? That's the carbohydrate group. So that's based around dietary guidelines. Those people in the top group did no exercise. No exercise at all. The next group, same diet, exact same diet, but they did some exercise. So they had to do a minimum of 5 days a week, 30 minutes of walking, and twice a week they had to do 30 minutes of resistance exercise. So that was the exercise prescription. Then the next group was the protein group, and they distributed the protein equally so that they had 3 meals a day where they met leucine threshold. They were actually having a little bit more, because if you look at the total daily intake amount, it was 125 grams, so divide that by 3. That's what they were having at each meal. So they equally distributed the protein so that they stimulated leucine threshold at each meal. And then that first group did no exercise, and the second group did the same exercise that the carbohydrate and exercise group was doing. Look at the result differences. So, just carbohydrate, no exercise, they lost nearly 5 kilos. More importantly, a whole huge chunk of that, a third of that, was lean body mass, muscle. So that's not good. Then you add the exercise in. Think about this. So 16 weeks of schlepping yourself out for a walk 5 times a week for 30 minutes and doing 30 minutes of resistance exercise, and all you get is 500 grams more? Who's happy with that? Nobody. Most people who would rather just sit on their bum would go, oh, why bother? Why bother? But then let's look what happened with the protein group. So the protein group who didn't exercise at all lost nearly 6 kilos. So more than the carbohydrate group who did all that exercise. Already you're going, well, this looks like a better plan. And if we look at the lean body mass and all of those percentages there, if you analyse those statistically, there's no difference. So you can do the carbohydrate stuff and exercise, or you can just do the protein and no exercise, you'll get the same result. Or, and this is where we reach that real sweet spot, and where we go protein and we put exercise into the mix there as well, and then we see great amount of weight loss for 16 weeks, right where we want to be really in terms of weight loss. And most importantly, the majority of that, it will never be 100%, the majority of that is fat. Only a tiny little bit is going to be lean body mass. And all that had got to do with was how we distributed that protein. So important. So, I showed you that table before with a few examples of just foods and stuff, but let's have a look at what might look like on a plate. This might visually help you a little bit more. So, 30 grams at breakfast, you said, I can't eat 5 eggs. Well, I can't eat 5 eggs either. I vomit. So, 2 large eggs, and then we put some smoked salmon, or maybe you're a bacon person, or maybe you've got some leftover meat sitting in the fridge from the night before, and then you just top it up with a little bit of cheese, and now 30 grams looks a whole lot easier to achieve. People say, oh, I'm feeling super healthy, I'm having a green smoothie, or I'm having, cereal for breakfast, or look at all of these things and consider, where's the protein coming from? It's non-existent, or it's minute. Let's have a look at lunch. So lunch can be a little bit challenging, but throw in a few bits of cheese or nuts and seeds, and you're there. Bit of a salad with some chicken, some feta, and you're there. And when you start with protein, whenever you go to have a meal, start by thinking about protein first. Because what we've been conditioned to do is think of the carbohydrate first. So you go to have breakfast, it's cereal, it's oats, it's toast, and then we might add something. But if we reverse that and started with the protein, then the carbohydrate that we added would fit in better. So always think protein first. And dinner's easy. Dinner for most of us is going relatively easy. Just have a bit of meat with some veggies or throw it into a soup or, I don't know, whatever you want to do. Dinner's usually the one that we can get to pretty easily.